Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew.
And I'm Reverend Koshal Finch.
All right, so now we are on episode 8 of True Words, a Shingon Buddhist podcast. And today's topic is going to be about different beliefs that Buddhists should have. Is that right?
I think so, yeah. I talked to some people this weekend, and they suggested this topic, and they told me there's probably a lot of misconceptions about what Buddhists believe or what people are supposed to believe, or what a lot of people think maybe they have to do or change if they're going to become Buddhist.
So what do you think, what would you say some of these are preliminarily?
Well, the same person told me their first thought, was whether or not they had to shave their head, or meditate for 4 hours a day, things like that. It was surprising to me. So I guess to answer that first question, no, you don't have to shave your head to become a Buddhist. In fact, I've seen some very colorful hairstyles in temples in Japan and the United States. So that is not a requirement.
Oh yes, I actually know a temple grandma who has very vibrant purple hair. So,
well, I've seen purple and red, all on the same head, actively involved in temple events and things of that nature. So that not a requirement at all to shave one's head or change your hairstyle.
But you are bald.
I am, yes, but that came about after my ordination. So before that, I had a nice coif of hair, and to this day, my parents complain that my hair is no longer there. So, but that is a choice one makes, not a requirement to practice Buddhism or to call oneself Buddhist.
Although, from what I understand, the baldness does come with ordaining as a monastic, right? And it's essentially almost every tradition.
That's correct, yes. And so I guess people will see variations in that. Usually it is a requirement to cut the hair as a sign of renouncing the world, either symbolically or literally. But usually I've heard some traditions say it should be an unstyled length. So there are some traditions where, for example, in Tibet, oftentimes because of the weather, the hair is worn a little bit longer, but not, I guess, unstyled. So maybe half an inch or something like that, where you still don't need to comb it or style it in any fashion. So, but cutting the hair for monastics, for people in retreat, it really makes a difference for how much focus is put on the self rather than energy we put towards other people.
Gotcha.
And also just, when you're in the monastery, there's very little time to bathe or take care of those things. So there's, I think, a practical issue around it as well.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So let's get into the meat. Well, yeah, I guess for lack of a better word, the meat of today's topic. So sort of some of the concepts that people might think are necessary to believe in to be Buddhist. For example, I think the most common one that I see is the question of, do I need to believe in rebirth or reincarnation to be Buddhist?
Well, so I think that's a really good one. So traditionally, all schools of Buddhism do accept rebirth. I think the problem that we have in the United States is Eastern thought came sort of in a bundle to Western countries. The traditions didn't come one by one. So oftentimes people confuse the Hindu version of reincarnation or some other author's individual explanation of reincarnation with the Buddhist idea of rebirth. So my answer, and this is just my answer generally is it's not a required belief, or and I think this also goes to a bigger concept in Buddhism of beliefs, and oftentimes that word or that concept is colored from Judeo-Christian perspective, that you have to take on this idea or else you can't practice this path or this tradition. So for those of us who aren't or weren't born with that as a background idea, it's not an absolute requirement. I do think, however, though, that through practice and study, it does answer some outstanding questions, and definitely the teaching makes greater sense, perhaps, with that idea is at least thought about more deeply. But the Buddha didn't require day one that, okay, first of all, everyone has to believe in rebirth.
Okay, and I think a lot of, at least a lot of the people that I've met in recent years, might not necessarily believe in rebirth, but they'll believe in the six realms and just explain it differently, more as 6 psychological states rather than 6 planes of existence that we will be born into after we pass away.
Yes, and I think even almost no matter what sutra you look at, the idea of rebirth and the 6 realms of rebirth work whether you consider them or take them as psychological states, or if you take them as actual places that the person would be reborn into. So to begin with, if someone has a problem, or that's where their mind stops and they say, I don't know how I should think of that. I would say, take them as psychological states and then investigate the path and the teaching. But there's no reason to get tripped up with that idea if it's something that you're not immediately comfortable with. A professor of philosophy I know once said, well, we don't have any evidence for it or evidence against it necessarily. So just because it's not my experience right now doesn't mean I should reject it. I just say, I don't have the experience of it, so I put that aside and I keep investigating. And I thought that was a really good approach.
Yeah, definitely. Especially because I think a topic like this isn't something that is necessarily verifiable with what we have right now. There's no solid evidence that we can possibly pull together from scientific observations, at least, to prove that these realms exist or do not exist. Especially when you factor in is it within the mind, outside of the mind, all of these other aspects of the 6 realms. It's really hard to pin down.
I would agree. And a few years ago, I went to a conference on consciousness, and it was a group of doctors, philosophers. You had the sciences and the humanities together in one room, and no one could agree on the definition of consciousness. No one could agree when consciousness began or when it ceased. So I think if we're really honest in all of the schools of thought that are investigating this question, it's still an area where, for most of us in the day-to-day, we don't have an answer. So I think if we maintain a open mind and a healthy skepticism, that's probably the best way to approach the study of Buddhism.
All right. Thanks. Is it okay if I move on to another question?
Oh, of course.
Okay. So something else that I've been asked recently is, as Buddhists, how should we approach the idea of Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, Dharma protectors, and the like? Are they considered celestial beings that can intervene on our behalf and actually provide protection? Are they, again, manifestations of the mind? Does Kanon represent compassion and no more than that? Or does Manjushri represent wisdom and, again, no more than that? Or how should we approach this sort of topic?
That's a really good, a very good question, and it's interesting that you asked, because I spent literally the entire weekend talking to somebody about this same topic. So I would again say, so I was not born Buddhist, and when I first came to Buddhism, I was struck by the amount of supernatural occurrences that were described in the sutras. But the thing that also struck me at the same time was the teaching being given or the description of events weren't dependent on those supernatural occurrences. So, for example, there may be a time when the Buddha is talking about wisdom, and one or other Bodhisattva or the Buddha or devas, angel-like creatures would come from heaven and emit light from their body or levitate or something like this. But it was almost sort of like a sidebar, and I realized that then the discourse of the conversation would continue. So I thought it struck me as very strange that the story didn't hinge on the miraculous description, or that they didn't then say, okay, now everyone must believe because they've seen this thing. It was in addition to. So I would say from the perspective, the same perspective as rebirth, it's not our immediate experience. That doesn't mean that we need to reject it, because nothing in the Buddhist teaching requires belief in supernatural occurrences, nor does the teaching depend on those supernatural occurrences. I do think that if we look at the time when the sutras were written and the cultures from which they come from, those types of relationships with beings other than other humans were considered natural. It's only probably since recent human history that that perspective is questioned. But I think there's a lot of reasons why we see it in the sutras. And again, I would say that's probably, I wouldn't necessarily say that people need to cease their study or be put off by that. The teaching stands on its own with or without those descriptions. So that type of perspective or faith is probably up to the individual. When I studied in Japan, that's amongst other Japanese practitioners, it's that's the perspective. The perspective is, yes, these Bodhisattvas, Buddhas do exist. They are, I guess maybe for lack of a different word in English, maybe on a different plane than us, and do listen and respond to our practice. Other people I met took a much more scholarly approach and didn't necessarily think of it that way, but definitely didn't, I guess, actively reject it either. So they had found sort of a happy medium between rejecting it and accepting it. So in my experience, though, even in the study of the sutras, if we see that scene where something appears to be outside of our daily experience, there's still a great deal to be learned, and it doesn't, the teaching doesn't rise or fall or depend so much on that display or that description.
Okay. Let's see. So I feel like this particular question holds perhaps a lot of significance to Shingon Buddhists, especially because a lot of Shingon Buddhism is based on ritual, and a lot of these are inviting these beings into the practice. Mm-hmm. So whereas perhaps other schools of Buddhism have these beings, they might not be as emphasized as much as they are in Shingon.
I would agree. I would say Vajrayana, Tantric Buddhism, both the Shingon and Tibetan traditions invoke the spiritual presence of beings, request their presence, request teachings from them during that time, and that is a large portion of the teaching. So my personal perspective, I guess I have two perspectives. I have a very Western American perspective, and then I have a Asian trained, someone who spent a lot of time in the community perspective. So I have both. So on the one hand, I would say, similar to what I said before, you can look at it from the perspective of psychology. You can take these beings as archetypes of aspects of consciousness. And in fact, that is how they are described in the text. You can also take them as actually existing supernatural beings. And in my experience, I've seen people who very rigorously, that's their perspective. And they have made a great deal of progress in the spiritual path and in their meditation. Almost as that perspective is very transformative. And I would say I've seen the same for people of other faiths, people who have a tremendous, faith, coming from a Christian or Jewish perspective. They find a great deal of peace, and I've seen them transformed by that belief. And then I've seen Buddhist practitioners who hold to probably what we would say a Jungian psychological perspective of, strictly looking at aspects of consciousness. And I've seen those same people make a great deal of progress on the path. So to coin a phrase from the Buddhist teaching, there are 84,000 different gates or perspectives or ways that someone can enter or practice. So both of those, I think, are legitimate within the Buddhist path. It's not. It has to be one or the other. And I think this is probably, from a Western perspective, American perspective, when it becomes an ism, people think it has to be one or the other, or they get tripped up with that one or other. Or I think, as both of us have seen, there seems to be sometimes a desire to find what is the original Buddhist teaching, or someone thinks of it as, what was the teaching before this cultural overlay, or what it appears to be a religious overlay. I don't think that actually needs to be done. I think you can have two people in the same temple practicing from different perspectives and doing the exact same practice. And those are both valid and useful to both of those individuals without tearing down or ripping apart, what may feel like an overtly religious perspective.
Gotcha. Thanks. So, since you brought up faith, that also leads me to my next question, which is, how should Buddhists approach this idea of faith? Because I believe this is from the Pali Canon, where the Buddha instructs, or he's talking to this assembly of lay people and says that you shouldn't take things just because an elder has said it or just because it's tradition. So, that being said, how should we approach faith in Buddhism?
The Kalama Sutta, yes.
Oh, yes.
So, faith is considered, and so this is the F word in Buddhism, especially in America. Faith is considered a necessary and encouraged support for our practice. So this is my experience personally, and my experience talking to and teaching other people in America, is that a lot of people practice meditation. A lot of people read a lot about Buddhism, but they haven't developed a strong faith. So when they encounter hardships, when life falls apart, or someone dies, or they have a very strong emotional reaction to something, they don't go to their practice. They don't necessarily fall back on benefits that they've gained from meditation. And I think a lot of times it's because there hasn't been a development of faith. When someone who's very close to us passes away unexpectedly, I don't think a lot of people are immediately going to reach for the meditation cushion. They may at that moment feel a desire to express their emotion or process their emotions through more of a faith perspective. But I think without faith, then we probably won't get as far in a tradition that's supposed to sustain us through life. That said, I think our faith is different than, it's not blind faith. It's something that's built. And what I found from the Buddhist path is faith is something that may be a little bit different for everyone. So taking the Kalama Sutta, don't take my word for it. Don't take it from the perspective of someone who's very well regarded in the community, or just because a lot of other people say you should do it, but investigate it for yourself. And the pieces that you find to be true, well, that's one maybe building block in your foundation of faith, and then build upon that. So it's a step-by-step creation of faith, not a overnight you must believe in it this way or you're doing it wrong. So I think oftentimes it's a loaded term coming from a culture that is not majority Buddhist, that people don't see faith in Buddhism as being different perhaps than faith in a theistic religion, when I think it is very different. And that might help some listeners in their consideration of how faith functions in the Buddhist path.
So speaking about faith, I think this kind of brings us full circle into how we started this conversation. What beliefs Buddhists should have or are expected to have? And from what it seems like there is no hard and steadfast belief structure. You can believe in the six realms as literal places of rebirth. You can take it as psychological states. You can take the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas as literal beings, or you can also take them again as representation of qualities. So, is there something within the Buddhist tradition that is a must to believe in?
Probably the key is change, right? We say the thing that you can bet on, you can't deny, it's observable, is change. Everything is nothing's permanent, and probably that gets at the root of my answers is how do you take these concepts? They're not static. I think if people do study the Buddha Sutras, there's going to be a point where what you just read is going to be turned around and told to you in a way that says what you just read was wrong, and now it's this way. And then you read a little farther and it says, no, the way you thought of it, just 5 minutes ago is actually a different way. And it's to make our minds more elastic. So I think if we look at it from so what is the Buddhist teaching getting us to do? The point of the Buddhist teaching is not ultimately that we have faith in Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, protectors, things like this. That's not the ultimate goal. And the ultimate goal is to get us out of kind of rigid thinking that has led to our current state. And that's only going to happen through a lot of mental gymnastics that is presented to us through practice in different ways. But that said, we're still human beings. We need hugs. We need comfort food. We need community. And as I often say, if you look around the world and you think about various philosophers, there's not a building called XYZ philosophism on a lot of street corners with groups of people getting together and bringing each other food and helping each other when they're sick. Whatever we think of a religion or philosophy with religious elements, as some people think Buddhism is. Buddhism definitely doesn't follow a lot of the same rules as other religions, but we still need things to hold on to make it through on a day-to-day basis until we're ready to transcend those things. So they're still useful aids on the path, and that's what they're meant to be. So if you do have a overt belief in a Dharma protector, Bodhisattva, as a supernatural being, they're not meant to be in that role forever. They're meant to be in that role for a time while you need it, and then to help you transcend that need. So that's a very different perspective than probably a lot of other religious paths, where it's very democratic. Every teacher is in the Buddhist teaching is there to give you a hand up. The hope is the students transcend the level of the teacher, get better than them, no longer need them even. So all these things are temporary. So that hopefully with that in mind, when people see these beings or statuary or this type of imagery within the Buddhist teaching, they're not immediately equating it with other religious forms, and I think that tends to be a big misunderstanding that sometimes turns people off. So if part of our podcast's purpose is to present traditional forms of Buddhism to a wider audience, I would say that hopefully that won't turn people off. They should inquire, what do those things represent? And as I always say, there's an answer to that question. It's not, just have faith or just believe it or don't ask that question. There's an answer for what these things represent.
Thanks. So something that I was thinking about after you were talking about change as being something that kind of reminded me of the idea of impermanence. But then something else that I was thinking about was the idea of cause and effect, or karma. And I think in my readings of a lot of Buddhist texts, this is the one thing that keeps being reinforced, sort of the belief in cause and effect. And I remember a lot of texts do encourage Buddhists to have a very strong faith that cause and effect does exist.
I would agree. I think stated, so cause and effect or karma is probably no different than the laws of gravity or the laws of thermodynamics. They don't care what you think of them. they are still there. And I think what's unique so first I would say most people misunderstand karma and think of it too much as fate. And in the West, when we use the word karma, we almost always use it in a negative way. We see something happen and we say, that's your karma. Or, you stub your toe and you say, oh, that's my karma. Something must have happened. When I was in college, I remember a store across the street from the university, and it said, if you don't want bad karma, don't shoplift from here. So it was always kind of presented in a negative light. And karma, from a kind of a strict Buddhist understanding, is just cause and effect, but cause and effect from intentional volitional action, not a punishment from someone else because you did something. And it operates both, I guess maybe from a Shingon explanation, from actions of body, speech, and mind, intentional actions of mind, our thoughts. So how we set our mind, how we focus our mind, determines who we become. I think modern psychology would agree with that. I think how we treat our body, how we use our body, determines a lot about the things we experience in the world. And you need look no further than watching the news for a few hours to see the effect of our speech, how we use words, the words we choose, how they're directed at others, has an effect both on the listener and on the speaker. So karma is something that we can observe, but I think it's often just very misunderstood as some type of supernatural force that's keeping track in order to punish us, rather than just the equal reactions and experience from that intentional type of action. Go outside and use harsh language, and it has an effect on people. It also has an effect on the speaker. People who and the sutras are very clear about the karmic repercussions of certain types of speech, certain types of actions. The Avatamsaka is famous for this, going through the karmic repercussions of different types of things, and it can be seen quite clearly. And I think if probably all of us at some point were bullied in school, or had something said to us that was not kind, and we had feelings about that, and we could probably observe the behavior of the bully. The worst bully in my neighborhood was abused, didn't come from a really good home, and as I got older I could see, he's acting out the same behavior that is directed at him. So it was, in one street, one block, city block, it was easy to observe the source of his karma, the action, and then how it affected both the listener, the receiver of his actions, and as well as the actor. So I think for a lot of us, especially coming to Buddhism from outside, we just have to keep in mind that karma isn't this, it's not a grocery list of these are all the things you did, and there's a point value to each of them, and it must manifest in the future in some manner to punish you. That's not the point of karma, but it is a teaching within Buddhism to both encourage us to analyze and change our behavior for the better, both for what we want in life, and so that we have an understanding of how our actions and speech work to either help or harm others.
Right. Yeah. As I think about this topic, I'm thinking that this topic of karma and cause and effect can have its own episode, actually. Because there's a lot that we won't be able to squeeze into the last little bit of this episode, but
that's
in
very
a future episode, though, I would like to come back to this.
I'd agree. I think a lot of these topics will probably come up again and again in greater detail as we go forward, and hopefully our listeners, if they have questions and suggestions, can let us know, and we'll include it.
Oh yes, definitely. I think for any of you listening out there, commenting on the YouTube link or on the Facebook page, we'll see those, and we'll try to incorporate your requests and your suggestions into the future episodes.
Absolutely.
All right, so it looks like we're out of time for the episode tonight. Is there anything that you'd like to end on?
Well, I would say we're getting close to episode 10, and I want to thank everybody who's been listening, and we've seen a tremendous amount of growth in a very short time, and that's encouraging us to continue and come up with new topics and explore new areas of the Buddhist teaching. So please continue to subscribe on YouTube, and let us know what you think.
All right. Thank you, Sensei.
Thank you.